The morning after his wedding, Edmund Cavendish, the Duke of Ashford, did something he had not done the night before. He looked. The woman asleep in his bed had dark lashes resting against pale cheeks, a small scar above her left brow, and hands that were folded beneath her chin like a child seeking comfort in sleep. She had a mouth that even in rest looked as though it had recently decided against saying something important. He had never seen her before in his life. Edmund stood very still at the edge of the bed. The morning light came through the tall windows the way it always did, indifferent, unhurried, and it illuminated everything he had failed to notice in the chaos of the previous night. The wrong color of hair against the pillow, the wrong shape of a face he had assumed he knew. He did not raise his voice. Edmund Cavendish had not raised his voice since he was 19 years old and had learned, the hard way, that cold silence accomplished far more. He simply stood there, looking at a woman whose name he did not know, and understood that something had gone very, very wrong. It had begun, as most disasters do, with perfectly reasonable circumstances. The date was the 14th of November, 1814. The Cavendish estate sat 12 miles outside of Bath, and the storm that descended on it that evening had not been in anyone's plans. The wind arrived first, rattling the upper windows and sending 2 footmen scrambling to secure the garden doors. The rain followed minutes later, not the polite, English sort of rain that apologizes for itself, but the kind that meant business, that came sideways and turned the gravel drive into a shallow river within the hour. Edmund had stood at the library window and watched it come. He was not a man who wasted sentiment on weather, but he had allowed himself in that moment one brief and private thought. This is not how I imagined the evening. He had imagined, in the vague and practical way he imagined most things, a quiet ceremony. The notary, the witnesses, the papers. Lady Cecilia Wren arriving composed and punctual, as she always was, because Cecilia Wren was above all things a woman who understood what was expected of her. They had been promised to one another for nearly 3 years. The arrangement suited both families. Edmund had no objections to Cecilia. She was handsome, well-mannered, and entirely uncomplicated, which was, at this point in his life, precisely what he wanted. What he had not imagined was 3 flooded roads, 2 overturned supply carts blocking the main route from Bath, and a situation in which the notary arrived an hour late, soaking wet, and in a state of considerable agitation. "The Wren carriage has arrived, Your Grace," his butler, Fenwick, had informed him at 8:30, though I must say the conditions on the East Road were. "Yes, thank you, Fenwick." The ceremony had taken place in the small parlor off the main hall, the one with the green wallpaper that Edmund had always meant to replace. The candles were insufficient for the space. Someone had forgotten to bring additional ones from the east wing, and by the time anyone thought to correct this, the notary was already arranging his papers with the desperate efficiency of a man who wanted to be home before midnight. Edmund had stood at the parlor door when they brought her in. She wore a deep blue traveling cloak, hood still raised against the rain, and she moved quickly, head down, with the particular posture of someone trying to occupy as little space as possible. Her face was in shadow. He had assumed, because why would he not assume, that this was Cecilia, flustered from the journey, embarrassed by the conditions, doing what composed women do when composure fails them, making herself small until it returned. He had not looked closely. That, he would later think, was the beginning of everything. The notary had been efficient. The vows were the short form Edmund had requested it. The papers were signed in the order presented, Edmund first, then his 2 witnesses, then the bride. He had watched her hand move across the page from his position beside her. The signature was careful, deliberate. He had noted in the absent way one notes such things that her penmanship was unusually good. He had not noted the name. Fenwick had ushered them both upstairs separately, as was proper, and Edmund had spent another hour in his study reviewing the estate correspondence that had accumulated during the week's preparations, because Edmund Cavendish did not know how to be idle even on his wedding night. When he finally retired, the candles in the room had been extinguished. The storm pressed against the windows. He had not lit them again. He had not looked. And so it was that the Duke of Ashford had married a woman in the dark, and slept beside a stranger, and woken to morning light that showed him, with complete and merciless clarity, that the woman in his bed was not the woman he had signed papers beside for 3 years. She was someone else entirely. And she was beginning, very slowly, to open her eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Vivienne became aware of the room before she became aware of him. The ceiling was high and unfamiliar. The sheets were finer than anything she had slept beneath in years. The light coming through the windows was the particular pale gold of a November morning after a storm, clean and cold, and completely without mercy. Then she turned her head and found the Duke of Ashford standing at the foot of the bed, fully dressed, watching her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not anger. She had expected anger. She had braced for it all night, lying rigid in the dark, listening to the storm ease itself into silence while the man beside her slept with the deep and unbothered rhythm of someone whose conscience was entirely clear. She had almost envied him that. But the expression on his face now was not anger. It was something more careful than that, more controlled. It was the face of a man who had identified a problem and was deciding, with great precision, how to approach it. He spoke first. "You are not Cecilia Wren." It was not a question. Vivienne sat up slowly and pushed the dark hair from her face, and met his eyes with the steadiness that had taken her the better part of 26 years to develop. "No," she said, "I am not." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. A muscle moved in his jaw, the only concession he appeared willing to make to whatever he was feeling beneath the surface. "Then who," he said, with the measured quiet of a man exerting considerable effort, "are you?" "Vivienne Wren." She folded her hands in her lap. "Cecilia's sister." The silence that followed was of the specific variety that has weight to it. Edmund did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, and the quality of his stillness was somehow more unnerving than any outburst would have been. "Her sister," he repeated. "Her elder sister." Another silence. "I was not aware," Edmund said carefully, "that Cecilia had an elder sister." Vivienne looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "most people are not." He left the room shortly after that. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about it. He simply excused himself with a courtesy that struck Vivienne as almost absurd under the circumstances, closed the door behind him with a quiet click, and was gone. She sat in the middle of the enormous bed for a long moment, in the pale morning light of a house that was now, by every legal measure, her home, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that was not quite despair and not quite relief, but lived uncomfortably in the space between them. Then she got up, because sitting still had never solved anything, and she had learned that a very long time ago. Edmund went directly to his study. Fenwick appeared in the doorway within minutes. The man had an instinct for when he was needed that Edmund had long since stopped questioning, and stood with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral. "The papers," Edmund said, without looking up from his desk. Fenwick produced them from somewhere about his person with quiet efficiency. Edmund spread them flat on the desk and looked at the signature on the bride's line for the first time. Vivienne A. Wren. The handwriting was the same he had noticed last night, careful, deliberate, entirely legible. Not the handwriting of someone writing in haste, not the handwriting of someone writing under duress. The handwriting of someone who had made a decision and committed to it fully. Edmund sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Fenwick, Your Grace, where is Lady Cecilia Wren? A pause. Fenwick, to his credit, did not pretend ignorance. That information has not been made available to us, Your Grace. The Wren family coachman returned the carriage to Bath before dawn. He has not been seen since. Edmund lowered his gaze from the ceiling. And her father, Lord Wren. Lord Wren sent a letter this morning, Your Grace. It arrived with the 6 o'clock post. Fenwick extended an envelope. I took the liberty of placing it on your desk, though I did not. Yes, all right, Edmund took it. He read it once. Then he set it down on the desk with the particular care one takes with things that might otherwise be thrown across the room. Lord Wren's letter was 3 paragraphs of elaborate apology that somehow managed to explain nothing, justify everything, and ask Edmund with breathtaking audacity to consider the situation settled, given that a Wren daughter had been delivered as promised and the legal papers were, after all, signed. Edmund read it a second time to be certain he had not misunderstood. He had not misunderstood. He picked up the marriage papers again and looked at the signature. Vivienne A. Wren. He thought about the woman upstairs, the steadiness of her gaze, the careful way she had held herself, the complete absence of apology in her voice when she told him who she was, as though she had been preparing for this exact conversation, as though she had rehearsed it. She knew, he thought, she knew exactly what she was signing. What he did not yet know, what he could not yet know was why. He returned to the room an hour later. Vivienne was seated at the small writing desk near the window, fully dressed, her dark hair pinned back with the sort of efficiency that suggested she had managed without a lady's maid for some time. She was not writing. She appeared to be watching the frost on the garden below with the focused attention of someone thinking very carefully. She turned when he entered. She did not stand. He noted that. Edmund crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her with the deliberate ease of a man on his own territory, and looked at her in the full morning light for the first time. She was not plain. He was not certain why he had expected plain, perhaps because Cecilia had never mentioned her, and people tended not to mention competition. Vivienne had the kind of face that did not announce itself immediately, but revealed itself slowly, the way difficult books do, and rewarded the looking. He pushed that thought aside. I want to understand something, he said. I imagine you want to understand several things, Vivienne replied. One at a time. He leaned forward slightly. You signed those papers willingly. Your hand was steady. You knew what you were doing. She held his gaze. Yes. Then I would like to know, Edmund said, with the quiet and complete attention of a man who was very rarely refused an answer. Why? Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the frost-covered garden sat perfectly still in the cold morning light. Inside, the fire had burned low. She opened her mouth. And then the door opened, and Lady Harriet Cavendish swept into the room without knocking, and the answer, the real answer, would have to wait. Lady Harriet Cavendish was the kind of woman who entered rooms as though she had been personally wronged by them. She was Edmund's father's younger sister, which made her, technically, his aunt, though she had always resisted the word with the particular vehemence of a woman who considered it aging. She was 51, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, and had lived in the east wing of the Cavendish estate for 11 years on the basis of an arrangement Edmund had inherited along with the title and had never quite found the right moment to revisit. She stopped in the center of the room and looked at Vivienne with the open, assessing curiosity of someone who has just found an unexpected object in a familiar drawer. So she said, "You are the one." Vivienne said nothing. Harriet turned to Edmund. "I heard, of course. The whole house heard, Edmund. These walls are not as thick as your father believed them to be." She settled herself into the chair nearest the fire with the ease of a woman who considered all chairs in this house to be available to her. "She is not Cecilia." "No," Edmund said, "she is not. Cecilia Wren has the most appalling cheekbones, always has." Harriet studied Vivienne with frank appraisal. "This one is rather better, I must say, which makes the entire situation considerably more interesting." She paused. "What is your name?" "Vivienne," Vivienne said. "Vivienne," Harriet repeated it as though tasting it. "The elder sister, the one they kept in the country." She tilted her head. "I knew your mother briefly before she died. She was a sensible woman. I always wondered what became of her daughters." Something moved across Vivienne's face, too quickly for Edmund to read it, and then was gone. "If you will excuse us," Edmund said, in the tone he used when he was not actually asking. "I was in the middle of a conversation." Harriet rose with the unhurried grace of someone who leaves only when she chooses to. She paused at the door and looked back at Vivienne with an expression that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "I would be very careful," she said pleasantly, "about what you say in this house and to whom you say it." The almost smile did not reach her eyes. "Welcome to Ashford, Miss Wren." "It is Mrs. Cavendish," Edmund said. Harriet's eyebrows rose a fraction. Then she left and closed the door, and her footsteps retreated down the corridor with the precise, measured click of someone in no particular hurry. Vivienne looked at the closed door for a moment. "You should know," she said quietly, "that she will not let that go." "No," Edmund agreed. "She rarely lets anything go." He turned back to Vivienne. "You were about to tell me something." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Then she turned back to the frost-covered window, and when she spoke, her voice was even and careful, the way a person's voice becomes when they have told themselves they will not be ashamed of the truth, even when the truth is unpleasant. "My father has debts," she said. "He has had them for a long time. I did not know the full extent of them until 6 weeks ago when Cecilia came to me." Edmund said nothing. He waited. "She came to my room at night. I had rooms in the east quarter of Wren Hall, away from the family wing, which I mention only so you understand that Cecilia did not come to me often, and when she did it was because she needed something." Vivienne's hands were folded in her lap. "She told me that our father's creditors had become serious, that the house would go, that she had found a way to prevent it but that she needed my help." "And the help she needed," Edmund said slowly, "was for you to take her place at this ceremony." "She had met someone," Vivienne said, "in Bath, a man she loved. She wanted to go to him. She could not do that and also marry you." A pause. "She told me that if I signed the papers in her name, she would use the marriage settlement funds, the portion that went directly to the Wren family, to clear our father's debts. She told me it was the only way." Edmund was very still, and you believed her. Vivienne turned from the window and looked at him directly. "I believed that the alternative was my father's imprisonment and my younger sisters losing their home. I believed that because it was true." She held his gaze. "I did not sign those papers because Cecilia asked me to. I signed them because I had no other choice that I could live with." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, a bird crossed the gray sky over the frost-covered garden and disappeared. Edmund looked at the woman across from him, at the steadiness of her, the careful, unbowed quality of her, the way she offered him the truth without softening it or performing regret she did not feel, and he felt something shift in his understanding of the situation, though he could not yet have said precisely what. "Where is Cecilia now?" he asked. "I don't know," Vivienne said. "She left the night of the ceremony. She took a bag she had packed herself and the carriage she had arranged herself, and she did not tell me where she was going." A brief pause. "She did not say goodbye." What Vivienne did not tell him, what she had not yet decided how to tell anyone, was the rest of it. She had known, when she walked into that parlor the night before, that Cecilia's plan had more architecture to it than a single impulsive act. Cecilia did not do anything without considering it from every angle first. She had come to Vivienne 6 weeks before the ceremony. Yes, but Vivienne had later found, tucked beneath the lining of her own traveling bag, a note in Cecilia's handwriting dated 3 weeks before that. In case you needed more time to decide, the note read, "Though I knew you would say yes. You always do, Vivienne. It is your most reliable quality." Vivienne had read that note in the carriage on the way to Ashford in the dark, while the storm gathered outside. She had read it twice. Then she had folded it precisely along its original creases and placed it back exactly where she had found it. She had not said yes because it was her most reliable quality. She had said yes because of Margaret, because of Rose, because her youngest sisters were 15 and 13 and had done nothing wrong and deserved a home and an education and some reasonable chance at a life that was not defined by their father's spectacular and ongoing failures. She had said yes because someone had to. Cecilia had known that, had counted on it, had built her entire escape on the foundation of it. And the most painful part, the part Vivienne turned over in her mind in the quiet hours, the part she had not yet found a way to set down, was that it had worked. Because here she was, in the house she had signed herself into, in the life she had chosen in place of someone else's. She looked at the man across from her, at the hard, clean lines of his face, at the intelligence in his eyes, at the controlled stillness of him that she suspected cost him more than it appeared to, and she thought, "He is going to want to undo this." She thought, of course he is. And underneath that, in the place she did not examine too closely, and I am not entirely certain how I feel about that. She did not examine that thought at all. She turned back to the window instead and watched the frost begin, very slowly, to melt in the pale November sun, and said nothing further. Edmund, for his part, said nothing either. But he did not leave. The east wing of Ashford had its own dining room. This was not an accident. Lady Harriet Cavendish had arranged it 11 years ago, shortly after Edmund's father died and Edmund himself inherited the title at the age of 23. She had presented it as a practical matter. She rose early. She kept different hours. She did not wish to impose on the new Duke's household routines. Edmund, 23 and inheriting considerably more chaos than anyone had prepared him for, had agreed without looking closely at what he was agreeing to. He had since come to understand that Harriet's dining room was less about convenience and more about territory. She had carved herself a kingdom within his house and furnished it with information, the particular currency of a woman who had no legal claim to anything within these walls, and had therefore made herself indispensable through the careful accumulation of other people's business. Vivienne understood this within 48 hours of arriving at Ashford. She understood it the way she had always understood things, not through being told, but through watching, through the way the housemaids hesitated fractionally before answering her questions, and then glanced, almost imperceptibly, toward the east corridor, through the way Fenwick chose his words with the precision of a man navigating a room he knew to contain furniture in the dark, through the way Harriet appeared at mealtimes she had not been invited to, and disappeared from rooms just before conversations concluded, and always seemed to know things slightly before she should. On the third morning, Vivienne came downstairs before 6 o'clock and found Harriet already in the main library. Harriet was not reading. She was standing before the window with a small leather-bound book open in her hands, and she closed it with a snap when Vivienne entered, not guiltily, but with the deliberate ease of someone who wants you to know they have nothing to hide and finds the suggestion faintly amusing. "You rise early," Harriet observed. "I always have," Vivienne said. "A country habit." Harriet set the book on the side table, not the shelf. Vivienne noted the side table as though she intended to return to it. "Sit down, Vivienne. I think we should talk." Vivienne sat, because she had learned long ago that refusing an inevitable conversation only delayed it and gave the other person time to prepare better. Harriet settled across from her, with the composed authority of a woman presiding over a meeting she had called. "I am going to tell you something," Harriet said, "and I want you to understand that I tell you as someone who has lived in this house for 11 years and understands it considerably better than you do." She folded her hands. "Edmund will have this marriage annulled." Vivienne said nothing. "He is too controlled to be angry about it now. That is Edmund's way. He saves things up and deals with them methodically. But when the initial shock settles, he will consult his solicitor, and he will find a way to undo what was done in that parlor." Harriet's eyes were steady and without particular malice, which Vivienne found more unsettling than malice would have been. He had a very specific idea of what his marriage would look like. "You do not fit it." "I am aware," Vivienne said, "that I was not his first choice." "You were not his any choice," Harriet said pleasantly. "That is rather the point." She tilted her head. "You seem like an intelligent woman, considerably more intelligent than Cecilia if the rumors about that girl's judgment are anything to go by. So I will speak to you plainly." A pause. "Leave quietly before he asks you to leave loudly. You will find it considerably more dignified." Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. The fire was low. The library smelled of old paper and cold morning air, and the particular dry warmth of a room that is heated just enough and no more. "That is very considerate of you," Vivienne said, "to concern yourself with my dignity." Harriet smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "I am a considerate woman." "I am sure you are." Vivienne held her gaze. "Is there anything else you wanted to say?" Something shifted in Harriet's expression, too brief to identify, gone before it fully formed. "Only this," Harriet said, and her voice dropped a note, losing its social warmth and becoming something flatter and more direct beneath it. "I do not know what you signed those papers for, or what arrangement you made with your sister, or what you imagine your position in this house to be, but I want you to understand something very clearly." She leaned forward slightly. "I have been in this house for 11 years. I know where everything is. I know what everything is worth. And I know how to ensure that certain information reaches certain people at the most." A small pause, inconvenient possible moment. Vivienne looked at her steadily. "Is that a threat, Lady Harriet?" "It is a description," Harriet said, "of how this house works." She rose, picked up the leather-bound book from the side table, and left the room with the unhurried grace that appeared to be her preferred mode of exit. Vivienne sat very still for a moment after she had gone. Then she looked at the side table where the book had rested. There was a faint rectangle in the dust. The book had not been there long or was not usually kept there. Harriet had been holding it when Vivienne entered. She had set it down deliberately in plain sight, not hiding it, displaying it. Vivienne looked at the shelf nearest the side table. Account ledgers, a full row of them dating back 30 years, stamped with the Cavendish estate seal, and one gap, a gap exactly the width of the book Harriet had just carried out of the room. She did not go to Edmund. Not immediately, because she had nothing yet but an observation, and observations without evidence were only suspicions, and she had learned, in 26 years of being the sister nobody mentioned and the daughter nobody consulted, that women who raised suspicions without proof were not taken seriously. They were managed, gently redirected, thanked for their concern and sent back to wherever they had come from. She needed to understand what she had seen before she decided what to do with it. So she watched. She watched the way Harriet moved through the house, purposefully, proprietarily, with the confidence of a woman who had convinced herself that long occupation was equivalent to ownership. She watched the way Harriet spoke to the steward, Mr. Gable, with a familiarity that went slightly beyond what their positions warranted, and the way Gable's eyes slid away from hers whenever she entered a room he was already in. She watched the East Wing dining room and noticed that deliveries came to it separately. not through the main house accounts, but through a separate arrangement that did not appear to go through Fenwick. She noted all of it in the small journal she kept in the inside pocket of her dress, not because she was certain it meant anything, but because her mother had once told her, "Write down what you see, Vivienne, not what you think it means. You can decide what it means later, but if you don't write it down, you will convince yourself you imagined it." Her mother had been a sensible woman. On the fourth evening, Edmund found her in the small sitting room off the main hall, the one nobody seemed to use, where Vivienne had taken to reading in the late afternoon because it was warm and quiet and nobody came looking for her there. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, with the fractional hesitation of a man who had not expected to find the room occupied. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I did not know you used this room." "I don't think anyone does," Vivienne said. "That is rather why I chose it." He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the air of a man making a small but deliberate decision, he came in and sat in the chair across from her, the same unconscious mirroring, she noticed, of the arrangement in the bedroom 4 days ago, as though they kept finding themselves in the same configuration without planning it. "Harriet spoke to you," he said. "It was not a question." On the third morning, Vivienne confirmed, "In the library." "What did she say?" Vivienne considered him. He was looking at her with the direct, unhurried attention that she was beginning to recognize as his default mode, not aggressive, not demanding but complete. When Edmund Cavendish looked at you, she had discovered, he looked at all of you, and it required a certain amount of internal steadiness not to find this destabilizing. "She advised me to leave," Vivienne said, quietly and before you asked me to do so loudly. Edmund was quiet for a moment. "And what did you say?" "I asked if there was anything else she wanted to say." Something that was almost not quite but almost amusement crossed his face. "That is all." "She also mentioned," Vivienne said carefully, "that she has been in this house for 11 years and knows where everything is." The almost amusement faded. Edmund looked at her steadily. "She said that." "In those words." He was quiet for a longer moment this time. His gaze moved to the fire and stayed there, and Vivienne watched him think, watched the controlled, methodical quality of it, the way he turned things over without rushing toward conclusions. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, still looking at the fire. Vivienne blinked. Of all the things she had prepared herself for, this was not among them. "I beg your pardon." He turned to look at her then. "I have been occupied this past week with the legal and practical dimensions of our situation. I have not asked you how you are finding the house, whether you have what you need, whether anyone has been," a slight pause, "discourteous." Vivienne stared at him. "You are apologizing," she said slowly, "for not asking after my comfort." "Yes. After I signed your marriage papers under a false name and replaced your intended bride without your knowledge or consent." "The circumstances of how you came to be here," Edmund said with great precision, "do not change the fact that you are here and that this is your home and that you are owed basic consideration within it." He held her gaze. "Whatever else is true." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. She had prepared in the past 4 days for coldness, for legal maneuvering, for the barely concealed contempt of a man who had been deceived and had not forgotten it. She had not prepared for this, for the quiet, unadorned decency of it, offered without performance, without any apparent expectation of gratitude. It was, she thought, considerably more dangerous than contempt would have been. "Thank you," she said, because there was nothing else to say. Edmund nodded once. He rose to leave. Then he paused and turned back with the air of a man who has remembered something he had decided not to mention and then changed his mind. "The ledger she took from the library," he said, "the one from the east shelf." Vivienne went very still. "I noticed the gap this morning," Edmund said quietly. He looked at her with those direct, complete eyes. "I think perhaps you noticed it before I did." He left before she could answer. Vivienne sat in the warm, quiet sitting room for a long time after he had gone, and looked at the fire, and thought about a man who apologized for things that were not his fault and noticed things he did not announce, and decided, with some alarm, that she was going to have to be considerably more careful than she had planned. It began with the horses. Edmund discovered her in the stables on the 7th morning before breakfast, before the house had fully woken. He had come down himself for the same reason he always did in the early hours, because the stables were the one place on the estate where nobody required anything of him, and silence was available without having to be negotiated. She was sitting on the low wooden bench outside Archer's stall, Archer being his most difficult horse, a gray gelding of considerable opinion who had thrown 2 grooms in the past year, and was generally regarded by the stable staff with the wary respect one extends to something beautiful and entirely unreasonable. Archer had his long nose resting on Vivienne's shoulder. She was not doing anything remarkable. She was simply sitting there, one hand raised to the horse's jaw, speaking to him in a voice too low to carry, and Archer, who had last week attempted to remove a groom's hat with his teeth and succeeded, stood with the boneless contentment of an animal that has found, unexpectedly, someone it approves of. Edmund stopped in the stable doorway. Vivienne looked up. She did not startle. He was beginning to understand that she did not startle easily, that she had developed, through some long practice he had not yet fully mapped, the habit of always knowing where the exits were. "Good morning," she said, as though it were entirely ordinary to be found in his stables at 6:30 with his most temperamental horse asleep on her shoulder. "Good morning," Edmund said. He came in slowly because Archer was particular about entrances and stopped a few feet away. "He doesn't like people." "He doesn't like being underestimated," Vivienne said. "It is a different thing." Edmund looked at the horse. Archer opened one eye, regarded Edmund with the profound indifference of the very comfortable, and closed it again. "He threw a groom last month," Edmund said. "The groom came in too fast and reached for the bridle before introducing himself," Vivienne said. "I would have done the same." Edmund looked at her. She glanced up and caught his expression, and something crossed her face, a flicker of self-consciousness, quickly managed. "I only mean that horses are not unreasonable. They simply have standards. And you share them." "I have spent a great deal of time with horses," she said. "They are considerably more straightforward than people." Edmund sat down on the bench across from her, the stable hands bench, low and worn, and looked at this woman who had been in his house for 7 days and whom he understood. He was beginning to realize, almost not at all. "You grew up in the country," he said. "Wren Hall is in Somerset," she said. "Yes." "You rode." "Every day until she stopped, began again. Until I was 17 and my mother died and there were other things that needed doing." She said it without inflection, the way people speak of old losses that have been handled so many times they no longer cut in the same places. Edmund did not offer condolences. She did not seem to want them, and he had learned long ago that condolences offered to people who have moved past the acute stage of grief are more for the offerer than the receiver. Instead, he said, "What other things needed doing?" Vivienne looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Archer, and her hand moved slowly along the horse's jaw in an absent, habitual gesture. "My mother was the one who ran the house," she said. "My father is," a brief pause, "my father is better suited to other pursuits. After she died, someone had to learn the accounts, manage the staff, negotiate with the tenant farmers. Cecilia was 14. My younger sisters were younger still." She paused. "So I learned." "You were 17. "Yes." "And no one," Edmund stopped himself. Vivienne glanced at him. "No one what?" "I was going to ask if no one helped you," he said, "but I think I already know the answer." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read, something that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude, and not quite either of those things, but lived somewhere adjacent to both. "We managed," she said. He thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. He thought about it while he reviewed the quarterly accounts with his steward, and noticed, for the first time, that Gable's eyes did not quite meet his when he asked about the East Wing household expenses. He thought about it while he rode the north boundary of the estate in the cold afternoon air. He thought about it at dinner, when Harriet appeared uninvited and dominated the conversation with the skilled ease of a woman who had made an art form of filling silences she had engineered. He thought about the girl of 17 who had learned to run a household because someone had to, and had apparently been running things ever since, invisibly, from the east quarter of Wren Hall, while her younger sister was presented to society and promised to dukes. He was not a sentimental man. He did not mistake difficulty for virtue. Plenty of people had difficult lives, and emerged from them no better than they had entered. But there was something in the picture assembling itself before him that he kept returning to, worrying at the edges of like a problem he could not yet solve. He had been told, when Cecilia Wren was proposed as a suitable match, that she was the eldest daughter of Lord Wren. He had not questioned this because he had had no reason to question it. It had simply been presented as fact, and Edmund, who moved through the world with the authority of a man accustomed to being given accurate information, had taken it as such. Vivienne was the eldest daughter of Lord Wren, which meant that somewhere along the way, someone had decided that she was not worth mentioning. The books were the second thing. He found her in the library on the 9th day, which would not have been remarkable except that she had evidently been there for some time before he arrived, and had, with no particular self-consciousness, reorganized the southeast shelf. Edmund stood in the doorway and looked at the shelf. "Those were in alphabetical order," he said. "They were in alphabetical order by title," Vivienne said, without looking up from the book she was currently reshelving, which means Aristotle's Metaphysics was between a mediocre 1756 novel called *Marcus and something called *Melancholy Reflections on the State of Modern Agriculture. I moved it to the philosophy section. She paused. "I hope that is all right." Edmund looked at the shelf. Then he looked at the book in her hands, a well-worn copy of Locke's essay concerning human understanding, and then at her. "You have read Locke," he said. She looked up then. Something in his tone had caught her attention. "Is that surprising?" "Most people find him," he stopped. "Dry," she offered, "dense, unnecessarily thorough on points that could have been resolved in half the pages." A brief pause. "Yes, he is all of those things. He is also correct, which I find redeems him considerably." Edmund came into the library and looked at the shelf she had reorganized. She had, he noticed, grouped by subject, and then by date within each subject, a system that was considerably more useful than alphabetical order, and that he would have implemented himself years ago if he had thought about it for more than 30 seconds. "The Harriet shelf," he said, noting a gap. Vivienne's hand stilled on the book she was holding. "I noticed this morning," he said, "that 3 more ledgers are missing, not just the one." She was quiet for a moment. Then she set the book down carefully and turned to face him. "I think," she said, with the deliberate precision of someone choosing each word before releasing it, "that Mr. Gable may be worth speaking to, separately from Lady Harriet." A pause. "I do not have evidence. I want to be clear about that. I have only observations." "Tell me the observations," Edmund said. She did. She told him about the separate deliveries to the East Wing, about Gable's eyes and how they moved, about the particular way Harriet had been holding that first ledger, not reading it, she said, but checking it, the way you check a figure you already know against a figure you want to confirm, About the note she had made in her journal on the fourth day. East Wing accounts do not appear to run through Fenwick. Confirm. Edmund listened without interrupting. He stood very still in the way he did when he was giving something his complete attention, and she watched him absorb each detail with the methodical thoroughness of a man building something in his mind, fitting pieces into their correct positions. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You wrote it down," he said. "My mother taught me to write down what I see," Vivienne said. "Not what I think it means, what I see." Edmund looked at her, at this woman who had reorganized his library by subject, and noticed what his steward's eyes did and written careful observations in a small journal she kept in the inside pocket of her dress, and offered him the information without embellishment or drama, simply because it seemed relevant, and he seemed like someone who could use it. He thought Cecilia did this, built her escape on this woman's reliability, and then left her behind without a second glance. He thought, what a magnificent and terrible waste. He did not say either of these things. "May I see the journal?" he asked instead. Vivienne looked at him for a moment. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her dress and held it out. It was small and dark green, and the cover was worn soft with handling. Edmund took it with the care one takes with something that belongs to someone else, and opened it to the first entry. Her handwriting was the same as on the marriage papers, careful, deliberate, entirely legible. Day 1. The house runs well on the surface. Fenwick is efficient and loyal. Lady H is in the East Wing. She knows I noticed the ledger. She wants me to know she knows. File under, watch carefully. Edmund read the entry twice. Then he looked up at Vivienne, who was watching him with the steady, unguarded attention she sometimes allowed herself when she thought he was too occupied to notice. He handed the journal back. "Thank you," he said. "It may be nothing," she said. "It is not nothing," he said, "and I think you know that." She took the journal and slipped it back into her pocket. Outside, the November afternoon was fading early, the way it did at this time of year, the light going gray and soft at the edges. "Can I ask you something?" Vivienne said. "Yes." She looked at him directly, that complete, undeflected look she had. "Why have you not spoken to your solicitor yet?" Edmund was quiet for a moment. "About the annulment," she added, in case he had misunderstood. Her voice was even, carefully even. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire had burned to a deep, steady glow. The library was very quiet. "I have been occupied," he said, "with other things." It was not the whole answer. They both knew it was not the whole answer. But Vivienne looked at him for one moment longer and then nodded, once, and turned back to the shelf. And Edmund stood in his library in the fading afternoon light and watched her reshelve lock in the correct place and understood, with the clarity of a man who has just seen something he cannot unsee, that he was in a considerable amount of trouble. She arrived on a Tuesday. Vivienne knew it was her before she saw her face because the house changed when she came through the door. It was not a dramatic change. No one announced it, no bell rang, no particular commotion erupted in the entrance hall. It was subtler than that. It was the way Fenwick's shoulders moved when he took the traveling cloak, the way two of the housemaids found reasons to be in the corridor, the way the air in the house seemed to rearrange itself, the way air does when something is introduced into a space that alters the pressure of everything around it. Vivienne was at the top of the main staircase when Cecilia Wren walked through the front door of Ashford. She had not changed. That was the first thing Vivienne thought, which was foolish, because it had only been 3 weeks, and 3 weeks was not enough time to change a person. But she had half expected, half hoped, perhaps, in a way she was not proud of, that Cecilia would look different. That whatever had happened to her in the week since she had climbed into a hired carriage with a packed bag and left her elder sister to face the consequences of her plan alone would have marked her in some visible way. It had not. Cecilia Wren was as she had always been, blonde, composed, and possessed of the particular kind of beauty that photographs well and disarms people before they have had a chance to decide whether they want to be disarmed. She stood in the entrance hall of Ashford with her chin up and her gloves still on, and the expression of a woman who had prepared for a difficult conversation, and intended to conduct it on her own terms. She looked up and found Vivienne at the top of the stairs. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Cecilia said, with the bright, practiced ease that Vivienne had watched her deploy 1,000 times at 1,000 social occasions, "Vivienne, you look well." Vivienne came down the stairs slowly. She had learned over the years that slowness was its own kind of power, that it communicated, better than any hurried response could, that you were not afraid and you were not rushing, and you intended to think before you spoke. "Cecilia," she said when she reached the bottom, "I did not know you were coming." "I wrote to father," Cecilia said. "He will have sent word, I'm sure." A small, dismissive gesture as though the logistics were someone else's concern. "Is Edmund here? I need to speak to Edmund." "The Duke is in his study," Fenwick said, from somewhere behind Cecilia, with the careful neutrality of a man who had assessed the situation and decided that strict formality was his safest option. "I'll find him," Cecilia said. She moved toward the corridor and then stopped as though something had occurred to her and turned back to Vivienne. "We should talk as well," she said. "Later, after I've spoken to Edmund." Her eyes moved over Vivienne with the assessing quality of someone taking inventory. "You seem to be settling in." "I live here," Vivienne said. Cecilia held her gaze for one moment. Then she smiled that particular smile, the one that never quite reached the upper part of her face, and went to find the Duke. Edmund was at his desk when she walked in. He had heard the carriage on the drive and had a reasonable suspicion about whose it was. He had therefore had approximately 4 minutes to decide how he intended to conduct this conversation, which was 4 minutes more than most people got, and he had used them well. He did not rise when Cecilia entered. He set down his pen with the deliberate calm of a man who has decided exactly how much of himself this situation is going to cost him, and looked at her across the desk, and waited. Cecilia sat down without being asked. She had always had that quality, the ability to make herself at home in rooms that were not hers, to occupy space with the comfortable authority of someone who had never had a reason to doubt their welcome. Edmund had found it charming once. He was finding it considerably less charming now. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You owe me considerably more than that," Edmund said pleasantly. "But an explanation is a reasonable place to start." Cecilia's chin lifted a fraction. "I know that what I did was wrong," Edmund offered, "fraudulent, legally actionable." "Complicated," Cecilia said, and Edmund almost admired the audacity of it. "Edmund, I need you to understand." "I understand perfectly," Edmund said. "You were in love with someone else. You did not wish to marry me. You devised a plan that allowed you to leave while ensuring the marriage contract was technically fulfilled, and you used your sister to execute that plan without her meaningful consent." Cecilia's composure flickered. Vivienne consented. "Your sister consented," Edmund said very quietly, "to save your younger sisters from losing their home. That is not the same thing, and you know it." A silence. "Where is he?" Edmund asked. "The man you left for?" The composure did not flicker this time. It cracked. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible change in the set of her mouth. But Edmund had been watching people's faces across negotiating tables for 10 years, and he caught it. "He is," Cecilia stopped, began again. The situation changed. "He left you," Edmund said. Not unkindly, simply as a statement of fact offered without embellishment. Cecilia looked at the middle distance for a moment. "He was not what I believed him to be," she said, which was, Edmund thought, the most dignity she had shown since entering the room. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it in the distant, impersonal way one is sorry for any person suffering, regardless of what they have done. "That must have been painful." Cecilia looked at him, then really looked at him, with an expression he had not expected, something unguarded and briefly, nakedly honest. "I thought," she stopped again. "I came because I thought perhaps we could," she gathered herself. "The marriage, Edmund, if Vivienne were to agree to." "To what?" Edmund asked. "To quietly disappear, to pretend the last 3 weeks did not occur, to release you from the consequences of a plan that used her as a means to your ends and then left her to manage the aftermath alone." Cecilia's jaw tightened. "I want to be very clear about something," Edmund said. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice, though it remained even, acquired a quality she had not heard in it before, a bedrock quality, final and immovable. "Your sister has been in this house for 3 weeks. She has conducted herself with more dignity and intelligence and basic human decency than I had any right to expect given the circumstances she was placed in. She has asked me for nothing. She has complained to no one. She has managed a situation that was created entirely by your choices with a composure that frankly puts both of us to shame." He paused. "I will not ask her to leave. I will not be asking her to leave. Is that understood?" Cecilia stared at him. "Is that understood?" Edmund repeated. "You cannot," Cecilia started. "I can," Edmund said. "I have. We are done with this particular topic." Harriet found Cecilia within the hour. Vivienne did not see it happen, but she felt it, the way you feel a change in weather before you can name it, a shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded the storm itself. She was in the sitting room when she heard them, not words, but voices, low and rapid, from the direction of the east corridor. Harriet's voice and Cecilia's voice, with the particular rhythm of two people who have found that their interests, at least temporarily, align. She sat very still and listened. She could not make out what they were saying, but she did not need to make out the words to understand what was happening. She had watched Harriet operate for 3 weeks. She knew the shape of it. She went to Edmund that evening. She found him in the library, their library. She had begun to think of it, which she recognized as dangerous, and did it anyway. And he was standing at the window with his hands behind his back, looking out at the dark garden with the particular stillness that meant he was thinking hard about something he had not yet resolved. "They spoke today," Vivienne said from the doorway. "Harriet and Cecilia." Edmund turned. "I know." "For some time." "Yes," he looked at her steadily. "Fenwick mentioned it." Vivienne came into the room and sat in what had become, without either of them formally establishing it, her chair, the one nearest the fire. Edmund's was across from it. They had fallen into this arrangement gradually, the way people fall into arrangements that feel inevitable only in retrospect. "They are going to say I forced it," Vivienne said. It was not a question. She had spent the afternoon thinking about it carefully, following each thread to its logical end, and this was where they all arrived. Harriet has been here 11 years. She knows people. She knows solicitors and magistrates and the particular men who handle the particular paperwork that could make this marriage disappear. She paused. "And Cecilia will tell them that she was the intended bride and that she never consented to the substitution, which is true, in the sense that she will present it." Edmund was quiet. "She will say," Vivienne continued, her voice remaining even with effort, "that I deceived you and deceived her and inserted myself into a contract that was never meant for me. She will say that she arrived as soon as she was able to correct the situation and found me," a brief pause, "entrenched." "And Harriet will provide the legal architecture," Edmund said. "Yes." Edmund came and sat in his chair. He looked at her, that complete, unhurried attention, and Vivienne made herself hold it, made herself not look away, because looking away felt like the beginning of a retreat she could not afford. "You could fight it," he said. On what grounds? Vivienne said. I signed those papers. I signed them knowing what I was signing. I cannot claim ignorance and I cannot claim duress, not the kind that would hold up. She looked at the fire. My father would not support me. He will do whatever preserves his relationship with your family, which means he will say whatever Cecilia tells him to say. A pause. I have no one who would speak for me. The fire settled. The clock on the mantel marked the half hour with a soft, domestic sound entirely at odds with the nature of the conversation. I would speak for you, Edmund said. Vivienne looked at him. You are my wife, he said, simply, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world, and he was mildly surprised it required stating. Whatever the circumstances of how you came to be that, you are, and I will not stand by while someone uses the law to remove you from a position you have done nothing to forfeit. Vivienne stared at him. Edmund, she started. I am also, he said, with a slight shift in his voice, something that was not quite dry and not quite amused but lived in the territory between them, becoming rather interested in what Harriet has been doing with my estate accounts for 11 years. And I think that if Harriet and Cecilia intend to make legal noise in the near future, it would be considerably better for us if that particular conversation happened first. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Something was happening in her chest that she was not going to examine in this room, in front of this man, with the firelight doing what firelight did. The journal, she said. The journal, he confirmed. And whatever Gable tells me when I speak to him tomorrow morning separately, early, before Harriet is awake. He paused. You said your mother taught you to write down what you see. How long have you been writing? Since the 4th day, she said. Then I suspect, Edmund said, that we have more than enough. Gable broke on the second question. Edmund had that quality, the particular stillness, the absolute absence of bluster, that was more effective in an interrogation than any raised voice could have been. He simply sat across from the steward in the small estate office at 6:30 in the morning, before the house was properly awake, and asked his questions with the patient, methodical precision of a man who already knew the answers and was giving the other person the opportunity to arrive at honesty on their own terms. Gable lasted approximately 4 minutes. The story that emerged was not, in its broad outlines, surprising. Harriet had been skimming the East Wing accounts for 7 years, small amounts at first, the kind that disappear into the ordinary noise of a large household's expenses, and then, as confidence grew, larger ones. Gable had been aware of it for 5 years. He had said nothing because Harriet had made it very clear, in the pleasant, implacable way she made everything clear, that his continued employment depended on his continued silence. There were records. Harriet had been careful but not careful enough, or perhaps, Edmund thought, she had simply never imagined that anyone would look. She had been here 11 years. She had outlasted his father, outlasted the transition of title, outlasted 3 different stewards before Gable. She had made herself, in her own mind, permanent. She had not accounted for Vivienne's journal. Edmund read through Vivienne's careful, undramatic observations with Gable's testimony beside them, and the two fit together with the precise, damning neatness of 2 halves of a single document. Vivienne had seen what she had seen and written it down without embellishment, and it corroborated Gable's account at every significant point. He sent for his solicitor that morning, not for the reason Vivienne had feared. Harriet found out at noon. She came to Edmund's study without knocking, as she always did, the small territorial claim she made every time, and stopped when she saw the solicitor, Mr. Aldous, seated across the desk from Edmund with a spread of documents between them. She looked at the documents. She looked at Edmund. Her face did not change. That was, Edmund thought, the most remarkable thing about Harriet, the absolute muscular control of a woman who had spent 50 years ensuring that her face never gave anything away for free. Edmund, she said, I did not know you had a meeting." "Sit down, Harriet," Edmund said. She sat. She did it with her usual composure, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her expression pleasantly, watchfully neutral. Edmund slid a single page across the desk. She looked at it. He watched her read it, watched the stillness of her become a different kind of stillness, the kind that is not control but suspension, the moment before a held breath releases. "This is a summary," Edmund said, "of 7 years of East Wing accounts, cross-referenced against the estate ledgers and supported by Mr. Gable's testimony." He paused. "There is considerably more documentation behind it." Harriet raised her eyes from the page. "I see," she said. "I also understand," Edmund said, "that you have been in conversation with Lady Cecilia Wren since her arrival yesterday, and that the nature of that conversation related to the legal status of my marriage." He held her gaze. "I want to be very clear about something, Harriet. Whatever you and Lady Cecilia have discussed, whatever arrangements you have begun to make, whatever legal avenues you have identified, I would encourage you to reconsider them. Entirely. And immediately." A long silence. "The East Wing arrangement," Harriet said, with extraordinary composure, "can be explained." "I look forward to hearing that explanation," Edmund said pleasantly. "You are welcome to provide it to Mr. Aldous at a time of his choosing." He paused. "In the meantime, I think it would be best if you spoke to Lady Cecilia and clarified that your previous conversation is no longer operative." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. Then she rose, with the same unhurried grace she always employed, and picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair, and moved toward the door with the bearing of a woman who had not been defeated but had decided to tactically withdraw. She stopped at the door. "Your wife," she said without turning, "is not what she appears to be." "No," Edmund agreed, "she is considerably more." Harriet left. Cecilia came to Vivienne that evening. Vivienne was in the small sitting room, her sitting room. She allowed herself to think of it, the warm, quiet one that nobody else used, and she was not reading, though she had a book open in her lap. She was thinking. She had been thinking most of the day because the house had had a particular quality to it since morning, a held-breath quality, and she had learned to pay attention to atmospheres. Cecilia came in without knocking. Vivienne noted that this was a family trait, apparently, though in Cecilia's case it had a different flavor, less territorial than Harriet, more the habit of someone who had never had to ask permission. She sat down across from Vivienne and looked at her with an expression Vivienne had almost never seen on her sister's face. She looked tired. Not physically tired. Cecilia never looked physically tired. It was one of her more infuriating qualities, but tired in the way that people look when they have been maintaining something at great effort and are running low on the resources required to maintain it. "He told you," Vivienne said. "He told me nothing directly," Cecilia said. "He did not need to." She looked at her hands. "Harriet came to me this afternoon and said that the plan was that she was unable to proceed." A pause. She was not specific. Vivienne waited. "I came," Cecilia said, "because she started again. I came back to Ashford because I had nowhere else to go, because I had made a very significant mistake and I had no one who." She stopped again. The tiredness in her face deepened. "I thought if I could undo what happened here, I could. I don't know what I thought. I thought I could go back to before." "Before," Vivienne said carefully, "meaning before you left, or before this arrangement was made at all." Cecilia looked up. "Before I was so stupid," she said, and her voice for the first time had something raw in it, something that was not performing. Vivienne looked at her sister. She looked at her for a long time, with the complicated, layered vision of someone who has known a person their entire life, who knows all the ways they are small and all the ways they are not, who has been used by them and protected them simultaneously, who has spent years being invisible to them, and has never entirely stopped loving them anyway, which is the particular burden of elder sisters the world over. "Cecilia," she said. "I know," Cecilia said quietly. "I know what I did to you. I know what I asked you to do, and I know," she stopped. "I know it was not fair." "No," Vivienne said, "it was not. I told myself you would be, that it would be." Cecilia looked away. "I told myself a great many things." "You told yourself," Vivienne said, with the careful evenness she had spent years developing, "that I would say yes because I always do. You wrote it down." Cecilia flinched. It was small, but it was real. "I found the note," Vivienne said, "the one in the lining of my bag." A long silence. "I'm sorry," Cecilia said, and then more quietly, "I am sorry, Vivienne." Vivienne looked at her sister's tired face in the firelight, and thought about 17 years old and account books and tenant farmers, and the particular loneliness of being the one who holds things together, and is never thanked for it. She thought about a note that said you always say yes. It is your most reliable quality, written by someone who understood her well enough to predict her, and did not love her enough to feel guilty about it. She thought about a man who had stood in front of her 3 weeks ago with cold fury in his face, and had since apologized for not asking after her comfort, who noticed ledger gaps and read her journal with careful hands, and said "you are my wife" as though it were simply and completely true. "I know you are," she said to Cecilia. And she meant it, partially, in the complicated, unresolved way that truth often operates between people who share a history. "What will you do?" Cecilia asked. "I don't know yet," Vivienne said. But that was not entirely true either. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came with the Morning Post, sandwiched between an estate matter from Edmund's solicitor and a social correspondence from a lady somebody or other in Bath, whose name Vivienne did not recognize. Fenwick brought the post to Edmund at breakfast as he always did, and Edmund sorted through it with the efficient, absent attention of a man accustomed to managing large quantities of other people's requirements before his second cup of tea. He stopped when he reached the third letter. Vivienne was at the other end of the breakfast table. They had fallen into this as well, breakfasting together, which had begun practically, because they were both early risers, and the alternative was eating alone in separate rooms like people conducting a Cold War, and had continued because neither of them had suggested stopping. She was reading. She was always reading at breakfast, which Edmund had initially found mildly eccentric, and had since come to find so ordinary that the morning she was not there, which had so far been none, but he had imagined them, seemed already quieter than he preferred. She looked up when he stopped moving. He was looking at the letter with an expression she had not seen before. Not anger, not the controlled, methodical calm he deployed over difficult things. Something more complex than either of those. Something that moved across his face too quickly for her to fully catalog before he set the letter down with great precision on the table beside his plate. "Edmund," she said. He looked up. His eyes found hers across the length of the table and stayed there for a moment. "It is from Lord Wren," he said. Vivienne set her book down. "He has been in contact with a solicitor," Edmund said. "Not mine. One of his own. He is requesting," a slight pause. "He is requesting that the marriage be reviewed on the grounds that the bride presented at the ceremony was not the bride named in the contract." The breakfast room was very quiet. Outside, the November garden sat gray and frost-edged under a low sky. Somewhere in the house, someone was carrying something heavy up the back stairs, and the footsteps were a dull, rhythmic counterpoint to the silence between them. "He is doing what Cecilia asked him to do," Vivienne said. Her voice was even. She had practiced even. She had been practicing it her entire adult life, and it had never cost her more than it did right now. Sitting at this breakfast table in this house she had begun to think of as hers. With this man she had begun to think of stop. "Yes," Edmund said, That is what he is doing. Cecilia must have written to him after Vivienne stopped. After our conversation, she said she wanted to go back to before. She looked at the letter on the table beside Edmund's plate. I suppose this is what that looks like. Edmund picked up his teacup, set it down again without drinking from it. Vivienne, he said. You should know, she said, because she had decided she would say it and she was going to say it before she lost the steadiness required, that I will not make this difficult. If the legal situation is, if it would be simpler for you to, she stopped, began again. I understood when I signed those papers that this was not a permanent arrangement, that you would find a way to, she could not finish the sentence. She looked at the table instead. I only want you to know that I will not fight it. If that is what you decide. The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Then Edmund said, Look at me. She looked at him. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before. The controlled stillness was still there. It was always there. She suspected it was structural at this point, built into him at some fundamental level, but underneath it or through it, something else was present. Something that had not been there 3 weeks ago. Something that she recognized, with a lurch of feeling she absolutely could not afford right now, because she recognized it in herself. I am going to tell you something, he said, and I need you to hear it clearly, because I am only going to say it once, and I intend to mean it every time after that without having to repeat myself. Vivienne said nothing. She was not certain she could have. I do not want to undo this marriage, Edmund said. I want to be unambiguous about that. Not because of the legal complexity, not because of what it would cost, not because of what anyone would say, but because I do not want to. I have known you for 3 weeks, and in 3 weeks you have reorganized my library into a system that is actually useful, befriended my most difficult horse, kept better track of my household irregularities than my own steward, and conducted yourself with more grace under circumstances that were entirely not of your making than I would have managed with considerably more provocation. He paused. I looked at the wrong things for 3 years. I looked at everything around you and never at you. I am not interested in repeating that mistake. Vivienne stared at him. However, Edmund said, and his voice shifted into a different register, still even, but with something careful in it, something that was making room for her. I am also not interested in telling you what you want. So I need you to tell me, not what is practical, not what protects your father or your sisters or spares anyone's feelings. What you want, Vivienne. Tell me what you want. The breakfast room was entirely, completely silent. Vivienne looked at Edmund Cavendish across the length of the breakfast table, at the hard, clean lines of his face and the careful intelligence of his eyes, and the absolute, steady, unhurried attention he was giving her, the same attention he gave everything that he decided mattered, and she thought about 17 years old. About account books and tenant farmers and the East Quarter of Wren Hall, and a note that said you always say yes. It is your most reliable quality, and all the years of being useful and invisible and reliable and not once, being asked what she wanted. I want to stay, she said. It came out quieter than she intended, but it came out. Edmund nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had already decided, and the confirmation was simply the last piece required before he could proceed. Good, he said. Then we have some things to deal with. He went to see Cecilia first. She was in the east sitting room, the formal one, not Vivienne's sitting room, which Vivienne noted with the private, slightly embarrassed warmth of someone discovering that a thing has become theirs without their quite noticing. Cecilia was sitting with her hands folded and her back straight, and the particular composure of someone who has made a decision, and is waiting to discover whether it was the right one. Edmund came in and sat across from her, and looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention he gave to problems he intended to solve. Your father has written to me, he said. Cecilia's chin lifted a fraction. I know. Did you ask him to? A pause. I wrote to him, yes. And Harriet, Edmund said, was she involved in the letter? Another pause, fractionally longer. She may have suggested certain language. Edmund nodded slowly. Cecilia, he said, and his voice was not unkind, I need you to understand something. What you are attempting to do, what you and Harriet are attempting to do, is going to fail. Not because I have decided it will fail, though I have, but because the legal foundations of it are considerably weaker than whoever advised you suggested. You were not coerced into being absent from your own wedding. You arranged your own absence. That is a distinction that matters enormously in law. Cecilia said nothing. Furthermore, Edmund said, Harriet is currently in conversation with my solicitor about 7 years of estate account discrepancies. She is not in a position to be anyone's legal architect at the moment. She has a considerable number of her own problems to attend to. Cecilia's composure flickered. I did not know about that. No, Edmund said. I don't think she told you about it. She found you useful and she used you, which is a habit of hers. He paused. You may find that familiar. It landed. He watched it land and he did not soften it, because some things needed to arrive at their full weight. Cecilia looked at the middle distance for a moment. When she looked back at him, her face had changed, not dramatically, but in the way faces change when a performance has been running a very long time, and the performer is simply too tired to continue it. What will happen to me? She asked. And for the first time since she had arrived at Ashford, she sounded like a person rather than a position. Nothing, Edmund said. If you write to your father today and tell him to withdraw the letter, and if you leave Ashford tomorrow and do not return without an invitation, nothing will happen to you. I will not pursue legal action. I will not make any of this public. You will be free to, he paused, to begin again, somewhere else, with somewhat more care than you have shown so far. Cecilia looked at him for a long moment. You love her, she said. It was not an accusation. It was simply an observation, offered with something in her voice that was almost not quite, but almost wonder. Edmund looked back at her steadily. I am working on it, he said, which is, for the record, considerably more than I was doing when I was engaged to you, and I think we both knew that. Cecilia was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her face. The last remnant of the composed, orchestrated Cecilia Wren falling away, and she looked, for just a moment, like the girl she must have been before she learned to be this. She always deserved more, Cecilia said, than what we gave her. Yes, Edmund said, she did. He left her there with that, because there was nothing to add to it, and he had other things to do. He went to Harriet last. He had saved her for last deliberately, because Harriet required the most precision, and he wanted to come to her having resolved everything else first. He found her in the East Wing dining room, her territory, her kingdom, seated at the head of the small table with a cup of tea that had probably gone cold, her hands folded on the table before her, with the stillness of a woman who has spent the morning being very still. She looked up when he entered. Her face gave nothing away. It never did. Edmund, she said. Harriet. He sat down across from her, not at the head of the table that was hers, but across from her, which was a deliberate geometry, an invitation to a conversation between equals rather than an interrogation. He had thought about this. I want to talk to you about the accounts. Mr. Aldous and I have been talking about the accounts, Harriet said. I know, I spoke to him this morning. Edmund looked at her steadily. I want to hear it from you. A long silence. Harriet looked down at her folded hands. She looked at them for a long moment, and Edmund watched something move across her face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, something more complicated. The expression of a person reviewing against their will a long series of decisions. Your father, she said finally, was not a generous man. Edmund said nothing. I came to this house when I was 40 years old, Harriet said. A widow with no children and no income and no prospects beyond the goodwill of my brother's household. Your father provided a roof and meals and the east wing and nothing further. No allowance, no consideration, no acknowledgement that I was a person with." She stopped. "I was useful to him. I managed the social correspondence and organized the dinners and made sure the right people were invited at the right times, and he accepted that usefulness as though it were simply what the air in the room did." She paused. "He did not pay me for it." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "So you paid yourself?" Harriet looked up. "Yes," she said, without apology and without shame, with the directness of someone who has decided that the performance is over. "I paid myself, a reasonable amount by any measure, not what a steward would have earned, not what a social secretary would have charged. Less than that, considerably less." "For 7 years," Edmund said. "For 7 years," Harriet agreed. Edmund looked at her. This woman who had lived in his house for 11 years and made herself permanent through the accumulation of other people's secrets, and who had, he now understood, been conducting her own version of survival in her own way, with the tools available to her. He thought about Vivienne at 17 with account books. He thought about the ways that women managed when the structures available to them were insufficient. He did not excuse what Harriet had done. He was not going to excuse it, but he understood it in a way he had not expected to, and understanding it changed the shape of what came next. "Here is what is going to happen," Edmund said. "You are going to work with Mr. Aldous to produce a full accounting of what was taken and over what period. You are going to repay it, not all at once, because I don't believe that is practical, but over an agreed period with interest. And you are going to relinquish the East Wing separate accounts. Everything goes through Fenwick, as it should have from the beginning." Harriet was very still. "In exchange," Edmund said, "I will not pursue legal action. You may remain in the East Wing if you choose to, though I think it may be more comfortable for everyone if you were to consider whether there are other arrangements you might prefer." He paused. "I will also establish a formal allowance, a reasonable one, retroactive to the beginning of your residence." Harriet stared at him. "You are not your father," she said after a moment. "No," Edmund agreed, "I am not." She looked at him for a long moment with the assessing, measuring regard of a woman who has spent 50 years reading people and is currently revising a significant number of her assessments. "The girl," she said, "Vivienne." "My wife," Edmund said. "Your wife," Harriet repeated. The word sat differently in her mouth this time. "I misjudged her." "You underestimated her," Edmund said, "which is a different mistake and a more common one." Something moved across Harriet's face, something that was almost, very nearly, a real smile, the first one Edmund had ever seen on her. "She will do well here," Harriet said, "if you let her." "I intend to," Edmund said. He found Vivienne in the library. She was not reorganizing the shelves this time. She was sitting in her chair. He thought of it as hers, had thought of it as hers for at least 2 weeks now, with a book open in her lap that she was not reading, in the particular way she sometimes sat with books when she was thinking. The afternoon light was already fading, the way it did at this time of year, and the fire had been built up against the early dark, and the room had the warm, inhabited quality that it had acquired gradually over the past weeks, and that Edmund now associated entirely with her presence in it. She looked up when he came in. He came and stood before the fire and looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that did not require immediate language. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She nodded. She looked back at the fire. He watched the line of her shoulders ease, fractionally, in the way that people ease when they have been holding something heavy and are finally permitted to put it down. "Cecilia?" she asked. "She will be all right," he said, "in time." "And Harriet?" "Harriet and I have come to an arrangement," He paused. She said you would do well here. Vivienne looked up. She said that. Approximately. A small silence. Then Vivienne said, with the dry, quiet precision that he had come to recognize as her version of humor, that may be the most surprising thing that has happened in this entire affair. Edmund almost smiled. She also said I should let you. Let me what? Do well here. Vivienne looked at him for a moment. And will you? He crossed the room and sat in his chair across from hers, the chairs that had somehow become their chairs, and looked at her in the firelight with the complete, unhurried attention that he had spent his whole life deploying on problems, and had recently, without fully planning it, begun deploying on her. Vivienne, he said. Edmund, she said. I want to say something to you, he said, and I want you to understand that I have thought about it carefully and I mean it without qualification. She waited. I am sorry, he said, that no one looked at you sooner. I am sorry that the people who should have seen you decided it was more convenient not to. I am sorry that you were asked to be reliable and invisible and useful for so long that you came to think of it as simply what you were. He paused. You are considerably more than what you were asked to be, and I intend, if you will permit me, to spend a significant amount of time making that clear. The fire settled in the grate. The room was very warm and very quiet. Vivienne looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, open, unguarded, entirely without the careful management she deployed over everything else. Something that had been held in place for a very long time, held by will and habit, and the simple necessity of not falling apart in inconvenient places, releasing all at once. Her eyes filled. She did not look away. She let him see it, which he understood was its own kind of courage, perhaps the greatest kind she had shown yet, which was considerable. You are going to make me cry in your library, she said, with the particular dignity of someone crying and refusing to acknowledge it as anything other than a minor inconvenience. Our library, Edmund said. She looked at him. Our library, he said again. Our house. He stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has run out of controlled, measured language and is operating on something less managed. Ours, Vivienne, if you want it. She looked at him for one long, final moment. I signed those papers, she said softly, in the dark, not knowing what this house was or who you were or what any of it would become. I know, he said. I would sign them again, she said, now knowing. Edmund looked at her. Then he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, simply, without ceremony, the way people take hold of things they intend to keep. And she turned her hand in his and held on, and neither of them said anything further, because there was nothing further that needed saying. Outside, the November dark came down over the frost-covered garden. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. For the first time since she had arrived at Ashford, Vivienne did not feel like a woman managing a situation. She felt like a woman who had come home. 1 year later, the frost came back in November, as it always did, quietly, overnight, without announcement, the way the best things arrive. Vivienne noticed it first from the window of the library, where she had come at 5:30 in the morning because she was an early riser and always had been, and marriage had not changed that, and Edmund had long since stopped pretending he expected it to. The garden below was white and still and entirely beautiful in the particular way that frost-covered things are beautiful, temporary, precise, gone by noon. She stood at the window with her tea and looked at it for a long time. The house was different now. Not dramatically. Ashford was not a house that went in for drama, which suited her, because neither did she. But it was different in the way that houses become different when they are genuinely lived in rather than merely occupied. The library shelves had been fully reorganized in the spring. a project that had taken 3 weeks, and that Edmund had assisted with on the grounds that the philosophy section needed a second opinion. And they had argued about Locke for 2 hours, and then agreed on everything except the placement of Hume, which remained, by mutual and slightly affectionate decision, unresolved. There were flowers in the rooms now. Not the formal, arranged kind that had stood in the entrance hall when she arrived, stiff and expensive and entirely decorative, but the kind that she had started cutting from the garden herself and putting in whatever vessel was nearest, which sometimes meant a very grand vase, and sometimes meant a rather ordinary jug, and Edmund had stopped distinguishing between them because Vivienne had at some point made clear, without making it a point of contention, that flowers were for rooms and rooms were for people, and formality could manage itself. Archer had a new stall in the stable closer to the others. He was still opinionated and still particular about who approached him, but the stable staff had learned slowly, with Vivienne's patient instruction, that he had standards, not moods, and that standards could be met. He had thrown no one in 11 months. This was considered something of a miracle. Vivienne considered it simply a matter of paying attention. Harriet was still in the East Wing. This had surprised people, Vivienne knew. There had been murmurs from the neighboring families, from Edmund's more distant acquaintances, from the particular social machinery of the county that ran perpetually on other people's domestic arrangements. People had expected Harriet to be removed, to be quietly but firmly relocated to somewhere smaller and further away, which was the traditional solution to the traditional problem of inconvenient relatives in inconvenient wings. She had not been removed. Edmund had kept his word and Harriet had kept hers, which Vivienne had not entirely expected and had been quietly glad of. The separate accounts were gone. The allowance was established. The East Wing dining room still existed, because some territories were worth preserving for the sake of peace. But Harriet appeared at the main table 3 or 4 times a week now, which had begun awkwardly, and had evolved into something that was not quite warmth, but was in the general neighborhood of it and getting closer. Harriet had said, in October, standing beside Vivienne in the kitchen garden, while Vivienne was cutting the last of the autumn herbs, and Harriet was theoretically helping but was mostly supervising. "You are not what I expected." "I know," Vivienne had said. "You told me that already." "I am telling you again," Harriet said, "because the first time I meant it as a threat, and this time I mean it as a compliment, and I thought the distinction was worth making." Vivienne had looked at her over the rosemary. "Thank you, Harriet." "Don't make it sentimental," Harriet said, and went back inside. Cecilia had written in the spring. A single letter, not long, in the careful handwriting that Vivienne had known her whole life. She was in Edinburgh. She had found a position as a companion to an elderly widow, not glamorous, she wrote, and not what she had imagined for herself, but honest work, and the widow was sharp and interesting, and Cecilia was finding, to her own surprise, that she did not mind it. She had not asked for anything. She had not offered elaborate apologies, which Vivienne appreciated, because elaborate apologies were more about the person offering them than the person receiving them, and Cecilia was, at least, learning that. She had said only, near the end of the letter, "I think about what I said to you, about you always saying yes. I have been thinking about it since I said it, and I want you to know that I understand now why it was a cruel thing to say, even if I did not mean it cruelly. I am trying to understand a great many things. I think it will take some time." Vivienne had written back, not a long letter, but a real one. Their mother, she thought sometimes, would have been glad of that. She heard him before she saw him. Edmund had the particular footfall of a man who was not trying to be quiet, but was naturally unhurried. A steady, deliberate sound on the floorboards that she had learned to recognize from 3 rooms away, and had not yet decided whether to be pleased about this, or alarmed by what it said about the degree to which she had learned him. She had decided, tentatively, on pleased. He appeared in the library doorway in the state. He was always in at this hour, dressed, because Edmund was constitutionally incapable of appearing anywhere undressed. But with his hair not yet attended to, and his cravat not yet tied, and his expression having not yet assembled itself into its daytime configuration, which was the version of him that she privately considered the truest, and that he probably did not know he showed her. He looked at her at the window. He looked at the frost-covered garden. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," she said. "I know," he said. "I keep hoping it will change." "It won't." "I know that too." He came to stand beside her at the window. He was warm the way people are warm in the morning, residual and unguarded, and she was aware of him beside her with a particular awareness that had not diminished over 12 months and showed no signs of doing so. "The frost is back." "I noticed." He looked at the garden for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her instead, with the complete, unhurried attention that she had once found destabilizing and now found. She was honest with herself about this, in the quiet early mornings, when there was no one to perform equilibrium for found necessary. The way you find things necessary that you did not know you needed until you had them. "You were thinking about something," he said. "I'm always thinking about something." "I know, what was it this time?" Vivienne looked at the frost-covered garden and thought about a parlor with insufficient candles, and a storm pressing against the windows, and a pen moving across paper in the dark, and a decision made in the space between one breath and the next that had led, through a long and improbable series of events, to this window and this morning, and this man standing beside her asking what she was thinking about. "The night we got married," she said. Edmund was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "I was thinking about how dark it was," she said, "how little either of us could see." He considered this, and now. Vivienne turned from the window and looked at him, at the familiar lines of his face in the pale early light, at the intelligence in his eyes and the warmth in them that had taken months to fully surface, and that she still sometimes caught herself surprised by, because surprise, she had found, did not always diminish with familiarity. Sometimes it simply changed shape. "And now," she said, "it is morning." Edmund looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had learned to read over 12 months of mornings, the one that was not performed and not managed and not the face he showed anyone else, that lived underneath all the controlled precision and came out only here, only with her, only when he had decided, in the quiet ongoing way that he decided things, that something was safe enough to be true in. "You finally looked," she said softly. Something shifted in his face. "I should have looked sooner." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He took her hand. The same simple, unceremonious gesture as that evening in the library a year ago. No performance, no occasion, just the straightforward act of a man taking hold of something he intended to keep. Outside, the frost-covered garden caught the first pale light of the November morning and held it briefly, before it began to change. Inside, the fire was warm. The library smelled of old paper and tea, and the particular quiet of a house that has become, without anyone planning it precisely, a home. Vivienne laced her fingers through Edmund's and turned back to the window, and they stood together in the morning light, the real light, the full light, the kind that shows everything clearly and hides nothing, and watched the new day come in. She had signed the papers in the dark. She had not known his face, his voice, his steady, unhurried way of moving through the world as though he had already decided where he was going, and was simply allowing events to confirm it. She had not known the library or the horses, or the frost-covered garden, or the warm sitting room that had become hers without ceremony. She had not known any of it. She had signed anyway. And in the morning light, the first morning, and every morning after, she was glad. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.